In this next topic, we're going to look at a couple of different policies from an economic perspective. So you've probably heard about some taxes before, right? One of the taxes that we're going to look at has to do with putting taxes on sugary foods and those sorts of things, but we also have general taxes that we're going to look at. The Patient Protection and the Affordable Care Act, the so-called Obamacare, has a number of different types of government policies built into it that we could look at. And then more recently, right, we've got an increase in the amount of tariffs recently that we can consider those from an economic perspective. Before we get into the looking at the different policies, though, we want to establish a way that we can try to evaluate the impact of policy. And what we do with that, the way that we do that is with these things that we call welfare tools. So I want to, moving forward, differentiate between market outcomes and welfare outcomes, right? So on the right here, I've got a graph of supply and demand and P star and Q star, and you already remember equilibrium price and you already remember equilibrium quantity. Recall, for a consumer, equilibrium price, that's the price that consumers pay when they buy a product. Equilibrium price from a seller's perspective represents the price they receive for selling their product. Equilibrium quantity, right, it's where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. It's the total amount of transactions. So we can think about it either in terms of the amount that buyers purchase, or we can think about quantity as being the amount that sellers produce. We want to look at two main welfare outcomes, right? So prices and quantities are our two market outcomes, and our welfare outcomes come in two flavors. We got consumer surplus and producer surplus. So we're going to take each of these in turn, but basically what these things do is they tell us about the well-being of the two different sides of the market, the consumers and the producers. So starting with the consumer surplus is a way for economists to measure the economic well-being of buyers in a market. It has a pretty straightforward equation and definition to it, and so we'll talk through that. We've got the consumer surplus is simply equal to willingness to pay minus the price that consumers had to pay, right? So if you recall, willingness to pay for a good was the maximum amount a buyer would be willing and able to pay for a good. So it's a reflection of your preferences, right? But it's also a reflection of your amount of resources that you have in your pocket. What are you willing to pay for a good minus what did you actually have to pay for it, right? In a rational decision by consumers, the willingness to pay, the value that they place on the good, has got to be greater than the cost of they incur of buying that good. So it's always going to be the case that when we look at rational decisions by consumers, the willingness to pay is greater than the price paid, and that difference is what we refer to as consumer surplus. So as a little example, right, I love talking about coffee. On a Monday morning for me, my willingness to pay for a cup of coffee is $4. You can think about, for you, what are you willing to pay for your first cup of coffee on a Monday morning, right? Whatever that tipping point price is before you walk away from that transaction, that's what your willingness to pay is. I'm willing to pay $4, but do I actually have to pay $4 for a cup of? No, right? It's usually much, much cheaper than that. Let's say that a cup of coffee is $1.25, right? That's the actual price that I'm going to pay, and so therefore my consumer surplus, using this really basic equation, is just going to be the $2.75 difference, right? The consumer surplus is money that I have, right? Willingness to pay is about the money that you have in your pocket, so to speak, that you are willing to pay for a good. I was willing to pay $4 for a cup of coffee. I only had to pay $1.25. My consumer surplus on that first cup of coffee is $2.75. Really straightforward way to calculate consumer surplus, right? It's just the difference between what you're willing to pay and what you had to pay. Let's think about two things. How could these values change? What if coffee, I had a stronger preference for it, and my willingness to pay went up to $6? If I have a higher willingness to pay, what's going to happen to my consumer surplus? Doing that math, right? It's going to go up to, I just struggled to do the math for a second, $4.75, right? So when you have a greater preference for something, right, it's going to have an impact on your consumer surplus. There's another thing we want to look at. Oops, another thing that we want to look at real quickly. Going back. What if, instead of having an increase in preferences, what if instead prices drop down to $1? If prices drop down to $1, our consumer surplus also is bigger. So again, we want this consumer surplus to be a measure of consumers' economic well-being. Does it make sense that that value of consumer well-being gets higher when you as a consumer have to pay only have to pay lower prices? Right, so yeah, it's got a nice little intuitive feel to it. However, right, it's got this criticism that it's based on ability to pay for stuff. So again, when we think about this top line, this willingness to pay, think about what you're willing to pay for a cup of coffee. Now think about what Mark Zuckerberg would be willing to pay for a cup of coffee. His willingness to pay is probably a lot higher, and so his consumer surplus is probably going to be a lot higher, but that's not based on necessarily underlying preferences, but that's based on some resources that he brings to the table that you don't have. Right, so this consumer surplus, this is the easy way to measure it. Consumer surplus, willingness to pay minus the price that consumers have to pay. That's the way to calculate consumer surplus on an individual unit. What we want to do when we're thinking about government policy is we don't want to just focus on how we measure consumer surplus on an individual unit, but we want to think about what's the entire consumer surplus for the entire market. And in order to find that, right, this is in words where we're going to look to get to that point. Let's run through this logic real quick. Let's assume that on the left, I've got my willingness to pay for my first, second, third, and fourth cup of coffee. And again, what you notice is that willingness to pay is a marginal measure, and number two, it diminishes, right? The more I have of something, the smaller my willingness to pay for additional units are. That's true for me. That's probably true for you. And if we aggregate it up and we add all of the different willingness to pay for all the different consumers in the market, that's where my demand curve comes from, right? So we can consider, what if we have a price of $1.25? If the price in the market is $1.25, then all of these consumers up to that point, they would find it rational to buy those products. All the consumers after that point are going to choose not to buy that. For those consumers who actually purchase it, right? And again, this is a point that's in the background but is somewhat important. We only define consumer surplus on those units that are actually purchased. Right? So all of these units that are purchased, the consumer surplus on that first unit is going to be the willingness to pay, which is what the demand curve tells us, all the way down to the price that consumers had to pay. And for the second consumer in the market, that's their consumer surplus in green, and the third and the fourth. And if I keep shading in for each of the individual units that are purchased, the difference between what you're willing to pay, what consumers are willing to pay, and the price they pay, geez, as long as demand is a straight line, which it will be in this class, then that shape looks like a triangle, right? And we totally know how to calculate the area of a triangle. Formally, this is an important thing to remember. Consumer surplus for the entire market, you find it by calculating this area below the demand curve, but above the price consumers pay. So you probably recall how to calculate a, what do you call it? A triangle. Oh boy. You probably recall how to calculate the area of a triangle, but well, let's go ahead and do that to the left real quick, right? So the area in green there, that area is equal to 1/2 base times height, right? 1/2 base times height. Let's think about what those different pieces represent, right? So if we know what the price is, then where that price hits the demand curve, that's telling me the quantity, right? The quantity demanded. The base of that triangle in green is going to be equal to the quantity. And I put quantity demanded here, but oftentimes, right? Not oftentimes, we define consumer surplus based on goods that are actually bought and sold. So at equilibrium, quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, which is equal to the quantity that's actually purchased Q star. How about the height of this triangle, right? So I've got the height of this triangle right here. It looks like it starts out at the value of price and goes all the way up to, oh boy, whatever the vertical intercept is on the demand curve, right? So the total distance, the total length of this height, it's the demand vertical intercept minus the price. Demand vertical intercept. That's what that shorthand notation is. And that's 1/2 base times height. That's a way to calculate the total area. Now notice, what are the units that are going to be on this area, right? So on the base, we're measuring a quantity. So if it's subway, it's subs, cars, whatever. Q represents the thing that we're purchasing, the amount of stuff that we're buying. But vertically, what are we measuring price and this vertical intercept on the demand with? Those are dollars, right? Fundamentally, consumer surplus is telling us the total amount of money that consumers were willing and able to pay for a good above and beyond the price they already had to. Real quick, think for a second. Why would anyone care about consumer surplus? We can think about this from a couple of different perspectives. So you could think about it from a consumer perspective. Why would that value of consumer surplus be useful for consumers? Why would that value of consumer surplus be useful to businesses that are in that market? Think about that for a second, right? And then we're also going to approach this. Why would the government care about knowing this? So that they can understand the impact of different policy on outcomes. Okay, consumer surplus. Now turning to producer surplus. Producer surplus, right? This has a very, very similar story to the consumer surplus, but it's on the other side of the market, other side of the transaction, right? Producer surplus is a measure of producer well-being. It's equal to, right? PS for producer surplus is the difference between the price a business receives and what did they have to spend to make it. What was the cost that they incurred to produce their good? The difference between what they had to spend to make their good and how much they received from selling it. Step back for a second. Does that sound like a similar concept that you might have done before? The difference between what a business spent and what they received? To work through a quick example, let's again think about my cup of coffee, which cost $1.25 for me as a consumer, but from a producer perspective, that's the price they receive from it, right? Right now we're assuming there's no taxes or anything like that. They received $1.25. How much did it cost for them to make that cup of coffee? More than likely, a cup of coffee costs about 15 cents or so. They're super cheap to make, right? There's this huge markup on coffee. Everyone should make coffee at home. That was a little normative. Sorry about that. So the producer surplus is simply the difference between the price that they receive in the sale and their cost of production. What is that? $1.10? Again, producer surplus is being measured in dollar amounts. It's very, very similar to a concept of profitability, right? But it's from an economic perspective, and so it's including the full economic costs of production, not just the accounting production costs. But it represents their gains in a market, right? If you recall, the supply curve tells us the cost of each unit that's being produced. So, similar to what we had for the consumer surplus, if we know what the price is, I think I did the price in red, right? If we know what the price is, the supply curve is going to tell us the quantity supplied in the market, and the producer surplus then is the difference between the price they receive and the cost of production, which is what the supply curve tells us. So again, just like with the demand curve, right? For that first unit, the second unit, the third unit, fourth, fifth, sixth, and so on, right? For each of these units, the distance between the price sellers receive and their supply curve, that distance is measuring their producer surplus. For the entire market, it's going to have the same story as what we told with demand, but just on the other side of the market. For the entire market, it's a triangle. So again, 1/2 base times height, but now think for a second, what is the height and base of this triangle? And when you calculate this producer surplus, it's going to tell you the total dollar amount that producers bring in from sales above their economic costs. So in a sense, it's a way of talking about how well off producers are. Again, we can do the thought experiment about things changing, right? What if, all else equal, the price they receive for a good goes up to $2? What's going to happen to their producer surplus? It's going to increase. Logically, does that make sense that when a producer earns a higher price and their costs haven't changed, that they're going to be in a better economic position? Sure, that makes sense. Let's try it from the other perspective. What if, again, go back to the original, what if instead of having a price change, what if instead They figured out a lower cost way to do business. So what if now coffee only costs 10 cents? What's going to happen to the producer surplus compared to the original price? Now the producer surplus goes up to $1.15. Again, when businesses figure out a cheaper way to do their production, it's going to put them in a better economic position. Producer surplus is a way to talk about how well off producers are. To summarize this thing in a general graph, right? We've got our traditional demand, we've got our traditional supply, and our market equilibriums of price and quantity. Again, where would we put the consumer surplus? Consumer surplus is the area. Start at the demand curve, go down to the price that consumers pay, in this case it's P star, and then go over to the quantity that they purchase. That upper triangle right here in a market, that's consumer surplus. For producer surplus, where is it in a market? It starts at the price they receive from the market, go down to the supply curve, which represents their cost of production, and you shade that in all the way over all the units they sell, which in this case is Q star, right? So that bottom triangle is PS. Does it look like these two areas, the consumer and the producer surplus, represent the same area? Stop for a second and think, what if we had a demand curve that looked like this and a supply curve that looked like this? Suddenly, is that consumer surplus equal to producer surplus? Not at all, right? It just happens that with this very traditional graph, I usually draw the supply and demand at 45-degree angles, but they don't have to be that way, right? We could have a steep demand or a flat demand, and that's going to change the relative size of the different consumer and producer surplus values.